December 6, 1942. RAF Chelveston, England. Frost clung to every surface as Colonel Curtis LeMay stood before the map in the briefing room, an unlit cigar clenched between his teeth. In 3 hours, 18 B-17 flying fortresses from his 305th Bombardment Group would attempt something that had never been done before, a formation so tight, so precisely coordinated, that it would revolutionize aerial warfare forever. The target was Lille, France, but the real experiment wasn't about the bombs they would drop. It was about the formation itself. What his crews didn't know yet was that this mission would create the blueprint for a defensive system so powerful that Luftwaffe pilots would soon give it a name that translated to flying porcupine, a wall of interlocking machine gun fire so dense that attacking it became a form of calculated suicide. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The mathematics were brutal and simple. A single B-17G carried 1350 caliber machine guns. Put 54 of these bombers into a combat wing formation, and an attacking fighter pilot found himself staring down the barrels of over 700 heavy machine guns, all capable of firing 750 rounds per minute with an effective range of 3,500 feet. This was the combat box, and its development would transform the daylight bombing campaign over Europe from a desperate gamble into America's primary weapon for crushing Nazi Germany's industrial capacity. The path to this moment had begun badly. On August 17, 1942, the 8th Air Force flew its first bombing mission from England. 12 B-17E flying fortresses attacked the marshalling yards at Rouen-Sotteville in France, escorted by RAF Spitfires. The bombers flew in loose 6-plane squadrons with 2 to 4 miles between each squadron, a formation designed primarily to prevent mid-air collisions between inexperienced crews rather than to provide mutual defensive fire. Within each squadron, bombers were stacked at 3 altitudes, with approximately 150 feet between the highest and lowest aircraft. All aircraft returned safely, with only 2 sustaining minor flak damage. But American air commanders knew this shallow penetration into occupied France represented nothing close to what would be required. The real targets lay deep inside Germany, beyond the range of any escort fighter then available. The bombers would have to defend themselves. The operational challenge was immense. Strategic bombing doctrine called for precision daylight attacks on specific industrial targets. Factories producing aircraft components, ball bearings, synthetic oil, and other war materials essential to the German military machine. But reaching those targets meant flying hundreds of miles through hostile airspace, facing both German fighters and anti-aircraft artillery. From bases in East Anglia to targets in central Germany was over 500 miles each way. At bomber cruising speeds of 180 miles per hour, missions lasted 8 to 10 hours. Crews would spend that entire time at altitudes of 25,000 to 30,000 feet, where temperatures reached 40 degrees below zero, and oxygen was required for survival. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The B-17E that flew those early missions carried 9 50 caliber Browning M2 machine guns, a massive improvement over earlier models. 2 were mounted in a powered top turret located behind the cockpit. 2 more were in a powered belly turret, the revolutionary Sperry ball turret that allowed a gunner to rotate 360 degrees. 2 guns were in the tail, turret, manually operated but providing critical rear defense. Additional guns were positioned in the radio operator's compartment and in waist positions on either side of the rear fuselage, plus a single flexible gun in the nose. The Browning M2 weighed 64 pounds, measured 57 inches long, and fired 750 rounds per minute with an effective range of 3,500 feet, significantly longer than the German 20mm MGFF cannons initially used by Luftwaffe fighters. The physical demands on B-17 gunners were extraordinary. The ball turret gunner, typically the smallest crew member, entered his position through a hatch in the fuselage, then spent the entire mission crouched in a fetal position in a space measuring approximately 4 feet in diameter, unable to wear a parachute due to space constraints. If the aircraft was hit and going down, He had to rotate his turret to align the hatch with the fuselage opening, exit into the aircraft, retrieve his parachute, and then bail out, all while the bomber was potentially spinning or on fire. The waist gunners stood at open windows, where temperatures at altitude reached 40 below zero, and wind speeds of 150 miles per hour roared through the fuselage. They wore electrically heated suits that frequently malfunctioned. Frostbite was common. In November 1942, a Luftwaffe fighter ace named Egon Meyer made a discovery that would force the Americans to completely rethink their defensive strategy. Meyer, who commanded the 3rd Gruppe of Jagdgeschwader II, identified the bomber's critical weakness. The nose of the aircraft, where the bombardier and navigator worked in a plexiglass enclosure, was defended by only 2 manual 50-caliber machine guns with extremely limited fields of fire forward. Behind that plexiglass sat the cockpit where pilot and co-pilot controlled the aircraft. A pilot killed at the controls meant the bomber would most likely go down, even if the rest of the crew survived. Meyer calculated that a head-on attack, though requiring exceptional skill and courage, would allow German fighters to concentrate fire on the bomber's most vulnerable spot. The tactic required attacking from 12 o'clock level, directly ahead of the bomber formation, flying straight toward the oncoming bombers at full throttle. On November 23, 1942, flying with his wingman Georg Peter Eder, Meyer shot down his first B-17 using the head-on attack. Within weeks, the tactic became standard Luftwaffe procedure. By December 1942, the head-on attack was the preferred method of assaulting American heavy bombers by Luftwaffe fighter pilots. The closing speed during a head-on attack was approximately 500 miles per hour. The B-17 cruised at about 180 miles per hour, while a German FW-190 or Bf-109 attacking at full speed approached at roughly 320 miles per hour. Combined, the closing speed reached 500 miles per hour, or about 730 feet per second. A German pilot had perhaps 3 seconds from the time he opened fire at maximum range until he had to break away to avoid collision. In those 3 seconds, a skilled pilot could rake the B-17's nose and cockpit with 20mm cannon fire, killing the pilot and co-pilot, destroying the flight controls, and turning a 4-engine bomber into falling wreckage. This was the tactical problem Curtis LeMay set out to solve in the winter of 1942. LeMay was 36 years old, a colonel commanding the 305th Bombardment Group. He had taken command on June 2, 1942, having spent the previous decade becoming arguably the finest navigator in the Air Corps. His navigation skills were extraordinary. In August 1937, as navigator under pilot and commander Caleb Haynes on a Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress, he helped locate the battleship USS Utah during exercises off California, despite being given wrong coordinates by Navy personnel. In May 1938, LeMay navigated 3 B-17 seconds over 620 nautical miles of open ocean to intercept the Italian liner SS Rex, approximately 725 miles off the American coast. The mission received enormous publicity and demonstrated both the B-17's capabilities and LeMay's navigation skills. By the time LeMay took command of the 305th Bombardment Group, he had developed clear ideas about how bombers should operate. First, precision bombing required straight and level flight during the bomb run, no matter how heavy the flak or how intense the fighter attacks. The Norden bomb sight required stable flight to calculate the precise release point. Second, LeMay understood that tight formations were essential for concentrated defensive fire. Scattered bombers were vulnerable bombers. Only by flying close together could bombers mass their defensive armament to create overlapping fields of fire. Third, crews needed relentless training until every action became instinctive. LeMay's crews found him demanding, unemotional, and utterly focused on mission success. He drove them hard and led by example, flying the toughest missions himself. The existing formations were inadequate. The 6-plane squadrons that flew the early missions were too spread out to provide mutual support. At 2 to 4 miles separation, bombers under attack received no defensive fire support from other aircraft in their squadron. Their 50-caliber guns had an effective range of 3,500 feet, just over half a mile. LeMay needed something tighter, something that would concentrate defensive fire while still allowing bombers to drop their payloads effectively and avoid mid-air collisions. The first improvement came in October 1942, when the 8th Air Force adopted 3 plane elements arranged in a V formation. This basic building block, 3 bombers flying in close formation with 1 lead plane and 2 wingmen, would remain standard throughout the war. But 3 planes were not enough. The breakthrough came in December 1942 with what LeMay called the Javelin Down formation. This 18-plane formation stacked bombers both vertically and horizontally in a pattern that resembled a spear point when viewed in profile. The formation consisted of 6 3-plane elements arranged in 3 squadrons. Each squadron had 2 elements. The squadrons were stacked vertically with the lead squadron in the middle, the high squadron above and to one side, and the low squadron below and to the other side. The key innovation was stacking planes within each element and squadrons within the group downward in the direction of the sun. This aided gunners on higher aircraft in seeing lower aircraft without being blinded by glare, while simultaneously creating overlapping fields of fire that covered every approach angle. The formation was 600 feet high from the lowest bomber to the highest, 500 feet deep from front to back, and nearly 2,500 feet across from one side to the other. Most importantly, every bomber in the formation could bring its guns to bear on an attacking fighter from almost any direction. On December 6, 1942, the 305th Bomb Group flew the Javelin Down formation for the first time in combat during a mission to Lille, France. 18 B-17Fs took off from RAF Chelveston, climbed to altitude, and formed up into the Javelin Down pattern. As they approached the target, German fighters made several passes but were unable to penetrate the concentrated defensive fire. The results were immediately apparent. German fighters that approached the formation found themselves facing concentrated defensive fire from multiple bombers simultaneously. The interlocking fields of fire created zones where attacking fighters were exposed to guns from 3 or 4 B-17 seconds at once. The formation worked so well that the other 3 B-17 groups in England, the 91st, 303rd, and 306th Bomb Groups, immediately adopted it after mission debriefings revealed its effectiveness. LeMay wasn't finished. By January 1943, he had refined the formation into a 21-plane wedge, adding a third 3-plane element to the most exposed squadron for additional support. The most exposed position in the Javelin Down formation was the low squadron, which flew below and behind the lead squadron. German fighters quickly learned to attack from below, coming up at the vulnerable low squadron, where their targets were silhouetted against the sky. Adding 3 additional bombers to the low squadron provided concentrated firepower at the formation's most vulnerable point. This configuration was tested in combat, proved effective, and was formally adopted by all groups on January 13, 1943. It became standard through September of that year. The bombers were stacked in a 3-dimensional array that looked like stairs when viewed from the front, a spear point when viewed from the side, and a diamond when viewed from above. Every plane had a specific position designated by squadron, element, and position number. The lead squadron consisted of 9 aircraft. The high squadron added 6 more bombers to the high right, and the low squadron added 9 more bombers to the low left, for a total of 21 aircraft in the group formation. Every pilot knew his exact position, and maintaining that position was critical. A 1943 Army Air Forces survey found that just over half of all B-17 seconds shot down by the Germans during attacks on European targets were aircraft that had left the main formation. The discipline required to maintain formation was extraordinary. Flying a B-17 inches combat formation demanded constant attention and significant physical strength. The pilot had to maintain precise airspeed, altitude, and position relative to other aircraft while wearing heavy clothing, oxygen mask, and flight gear at altitudes where temperatures reached 40 degrees below zero. The turbulence from prop wash of leading bombers made formation flying even more difficult. Each B-17's 4 engines created massive vortices of disturbed air, extending back hundreds of feet behind each bomber. Aircraft flying in trail or in lower positions encountered constant turbulence. The B-17's control system was not power-assisted. Moving the control, yoke, rudder pedals, and throttles required physical force. After 6 hours in formation at altitude, pilots' arms felt like concrete. The defensive effectiveness of the combat box became clear during missions in early 1943. On January 27, 1943, the 8th Air Force flew its first mission against a target inside Germany proper, attacking the naval yards at Wilhelmshaven. 53 B-17 seconds and 20 B-24 seconds were dispatched. The 305th Bomb Group participated, flying in the combat box formation LeMay had developed. German fighters intercepted the formations over the Frisian Islands and attacked with typical aggression, but the concentrated defensive fire from the tight formations forced them to break off attacks earlier and made accurate shooting far more difficult. 3 bombers were lost from the entire force, a loss rate of just over 4%, far below the 20% losses that would be sustained on later unescorted deep penetration missions. The critical vulnerability that remained was the bombers' weak forward armament. Even with the combat box formation providing concentrated defensive fire from the sides, top, bottom, and rear, the head-on attack continued to prove devastatingly effective. Luftwaffe pilots refined their tactics throughout early 1943. Fighter units would position themselves ahead of the bomber stream, then set up their attack runs. They attacked in waves of 3 or 4 aircraft abreast, the Kette formation, flying straight at the lead bomber formation. At 1,000 yards range, they opened fire with their 20mm cannons and 13mm machine guns. The FW-190 fighters carried 4 MG-151 20mm cannons plus 2 MG-17 machine guns in the later models. At 500 yards, the German pilots would fire a final burst and then execute violent breakaway maneuvers. Some pilots were so skilled and aggressive that they held their fire until 300 yards or closer, ensuring maximum effect. The Americans attempted various solutions to the forward firepower problem. Some groups experimented with adding single manual 50 caliber guns in cheek mounts on each side of the nose, giving the navigator and bombardier additional weapons. The cheek guns helped cover some of the forward blind spot, but the fields of fire remained limited. The breakthrough came with the development of a remotely operated chin turret, mounting 2 50 caliber guns directly below the bombardier's position. The Bendix chin turret was electrically powered and could be aimed using a hand control while the gunner sighted through a reflector gun sight. The turret provided true forward firing capability and could track targets through a wide arc covering the entire forward hemisphere. By summer 1943, the B-17G began entering service with the chin turret as standard equipment. This definitive version of the Flying Fortress carried 13 50 caliber machine guns, the most heavily armed bomber in the American inventory. The armament was distributed across 5 powered turrets and 4 manual positions. 2 guns in the Bendix chin turret defended against head-on attacks. 2 cheek guns in manual ball socket mounts on either side of the nose provided additional forward coverage. 2 guns in the dorsal turret located just after the cockpit and operated by the flight engineer covered attacks from above and to the sides. 2 guns in the Sperry ball turret mounted in the belly of the aircraft defended against attacks from below. 2 guns in the manual waist positions, 1 on each side of the rear fuselage, covered the beam positions. 1 flexible gun in the radio operator's compartment provided additional coverage from above and rear. 2 guns in the tail turret provided critical rear defense. The tail guns had the longest effective killing zone, extending roughly 1,000 yards directly behind the bomber. The B-17G finally provided comprehensive defensive coverage from every angle. A crew of 10 operated the aircraft. The pilot commanded the aircraft and led the crew. The co-pilot assisted with flying duties, managed engine controls, and would take over flying if the pilot was incapacitated. The navigator was responsible for all navigation duties. The bombardier operated the Norden bomb sight during the bomb run and also operated the chin turret before and after the bomb run. The flight engineer monitored engine performance, fuel consumption, hydraulic pressures, electrical systems, and operated the top turret. The radio operator managed all communications and operated the radio room gun. The ball turret gunner spent most of the mission in his spherical turret beneath the aircraft. The two waist gunners stood at open windows on either side of the rear fuselage. The tail gunner occupied the tail position alone, lying prone behind his guns for hours, watching for attacks from behind. The Luftwaffe response to improved bomber armament was to increase their own firepower and develop new tactics. Examination of wrecked B-17 seconds revealed that bringing down a heavy bomber from the rear required approximately 20 hits with 20mm cannon shells. Analysis of combat footage using gun cameras showed that pilots of average ability hit bombers with only about 2% of the rounds they fired when attacking from the rear. The math was brutal. To achieve 20 hits, an average pilot needed to fire 1,020mm rounds, but the early Focke-Wulf 190 carried only 500 rounds of 20mm ammunition total. Even expending all ammunition provided only 10 hits on average, not enough to guarantee a kill. The solution was heavier weapons. Later versions of the FW-190 carried 4 or even 6 MG-151 20mm cannons, plus twin MG-131 13mm heavy machine guns. Some aircraft were fitted with experimental heavy cannon. The Bordkanone BK-37 was a 37mm automatic cannon. The Mk-103 was a 30mm cannon. Some specialized bomber-destroyer aircraft carried even larger weapons. These massive weapons could destroy a bomber with 1 or 2 hits, but they were difficult to aim, heavy, reduced aircraft performance, and had very limited ammunition. The Luftwaffe also experimented with unguided rockets. The Wurfgranat 21 was a 21cm rocket carried in simple tube launchers mounted under the wings. The WGR-21 packed massive explosive power. A direct hit would destroy a B-17, but the rockets were difficult to use. They had terrible ballistic properties and no guidance system. Pilots had to fire at ranges of 800 to 1,000 yards, outside the effective range of bomber defensive guns. Hit rates were extremely low, but the rockets were effective psychological weapons. Seeing large rockets trailing smoke flying toward the formation caused bomber pilots to take evasive action, breaking up the tight formations and disrupting the bomb run. As the 8th Air Force expanded in size during 1943, the combat box formations evolved to accommodate larger numbers of aircraft. By spring 1943, the 8th had grown to 16 groups of B-17 seconds and 4 groups of B-24 Liberators. Mission sizes reached 100 to 200 bombers. The basic group formation of 18 to 21 planes was expanded to create combat wing formations. 3 groups flying together as a wing, stacked vertically and horizontally, created a 54-plane formation that could project truly massive defensive firepower. This wing box became standard for major missions, from early 1943 through May 1944. The groups were positioned with a lead group in the center, a high group above and to one side, and a low group below and to the other side. The wing box occupied a volume of airspace roughly 3,000 feet high, 7,000 feet deep, and 2,000 feet across. The 54-plane combat wing was capable of fielding upwards of 700 heavy-caliber defensive machine guns when fully equipped with B-17Gs. 54 bombers, each carrying 13 guns, equaled 702 heavy-caliber machine guns total. A Luftwaffe pilot attacking such a formation faced the reality that dozens of gunners were tracking him visually through their sights, and hundreds of bullets were converging on his flight path. The tracer rounds, every 5th round in the belt, created visible streams of fire. From a distance, the formations looked like porcupines, with dozens of fiery quills extending in all directions. German fighter pilots began calling the B-17 combat box formations Fliegendes Stachelschwein, or flying porcupines, a term that perfectly captured the visual impression and tactical reality of attacking massed bombers. Oberleutnant Heinz Nock, a Luftwaffe fighter ace with 33 confirmed victories flying with Jagdgeschwader 11, described the experience in his combat diary. "Attacking the American bombers is like flying into a wall of fire," he wrote. "The tracers come from every direction. You pick your target, line up for the attack, and suddenly the air around you fills with red tracers. You fire your guns, try to get hits on the bomber, and then you dive away, praying that nothing vital was hit. Major Anton Haeckel, who ended the war with 192 confirmed victories, explained the tactical problem. If one came in from the rear, there was a long period closing from 1,000 meters to our firing range of 400 meters when the bombers were firing at us, but we could not effectively return fire. The 50 caliber guns on the bombers had longer range than our guns. Attacking from the front was better because the closing speed was so high that we were in their firing zone for less time, but the front attacks required much more skill and nerve. The rigid formation discipline required by the combat box created one critical vulnerability that could not be overcome. Individual bombers could not take evasive action while in formation. They had to fly straight and level, maintaining position regardless of flak or fighter attacks. This made the formations vulnerable to German anti-aircraft artillery. The Luftwaffe flak arm eventually numbered over 1 million personnel, operating thousands of heavy anti-aircraft guns. The standard German heavy flak gun was the legendary 8.8 cm flak 18363741 series, which fired an 8.8 kg high-explosive shell to altitudes exceeding 30,000 feet. These guns were positioned in batteries around key targets. When formations approached, the flak batteries would calculate where the formation would be in 30 seconds and fill that airspace with exploding shells. Flak was responsible for 40% of all wounds sustained by 8th Air Force personnel, a higher percentage than fighter attacks. The rigid formation flying required by the combat box made evasive maneuvering impossible, turning the bombers into predictable targets for accurately aimed anti-aircraft fire. The true test of the combat box formation came during the deep penetration missions of August and October 1943. These missions pushed American bomber doctrine to its absolute limits and revealed both the formation's strengths and its fatal weakness when operating without fighter escort. On August 17, 1943, exactly 1 year after the 8th Air Force's first mission, 376 B-17 seconds launched a double-strike mission against the Messerschmitt aircraft factory at Regensburg and the ball-bearing plants at Schweinfurt. This was the largest and most ambitious American bombing operation attempted to that date. Curtis LeMay, now commanding the 3rd Air Division, would personally lead the Regensburg mission. The Regensburg force, consisting of 146 B-17 bombers from 7 bomb groups, would strike first, then continue south across the Alps to bases in North Africa. The Schweinfurt force, consisting of 230 B-17 bombers from 9 groups, would follow and return to England. The mission began badly. Dense fog covered English airfields. Weather delays forced a 3-hour gap between the 2 strikes instead of the planned 30 minutes. This destroyed the entire tactical plan. German radar tracked both formations from takeoff. The long delay gave German fighter controllers time to land, rearm, refuel, and attack both formations. The Regensburg force encountered German fighters almost immediately after crossing the Dutch coast. BF 109 seconds and FW 190 seconds attacked in waves. The head-on attacks came first, with 3 and 4 fighters abreast boring straight at the lead bombers. Despite the attacks, the formations pressed on. At Regensburg, the bombing was accurate, and the Messerschmitt factory was hit hard, but the price was high. 24 B-17 seconds were shot down. The Schweinfurt force fared even worse. Delayed by hours, they faced German fighters that had already attacked the Regensburg force, returned to base, rearmed, and taken off again. The Schweinfurt force lost 36 B-17 seconds out of 183 that reached the target. Combined losses for the day were 60 bombers and approximately 600 crewmen, a loss rate of 20%. Despite the losses, the combat box formations performed exactly as designed. A post-mission survey by the USAAF analyzed loss patterns and found that over half the bombers shot down had left the protection of the main formation. Aircraft that fell out of formation due to battle damage, mechanical failure, or crew errors were quickly swarmed by German fighters. Once separated from the formation's protective firepower, a bomber typically survived less than 5 minutes before being shot down. The problem was that in August 1943, no long-range escort fighter existed. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt had the performance to engage German fighters on equal terms, but its combat radius was limited. With internal fuel only, the P-47 could escort bombers to approximately 125 miles from a base. With external 75-gallon drop tanks introduced in August 1943, the radius extended to 230 miles. With 108-gallon drop tanks introduced in September 1943, radius reached 275 miles. This was enough to cover missions to targets in the Low Countries, northern France, and western Germany, but inadequate for deep penetration missions to central Germany. While waiting for long-range escorts, the 8th Air Force continued refining the combat box to maximize defensive effectiveness. In September 1943, a new configuration was tested using a 36-plane group formation. This was created by doubling the number of 3-plane elements in each squadron, while placing all 3 planes within an element at the same altitude to reduce collision risk. The result was a more compact formation that was easier to maintain and provided better bombing concentration. By late 1943, groups could choose between the 21-plane compact formation for small missions, the 36-plane group formation for better bombing accuracy, or the 54-plane wing formation for maximum defensive firepower. The critical test came on October 14, 1943, when the 8th Air Force returned to Schweinfurt for a second attempt to destroy the ball-bearing plants. This mission would become known as Black Thursday, the bloodiest day in 8th Air Force history. 291 B-17 seconds took off that morning from bases across East Anglia. Weather was miserable. Assembly into formation took longer than planned. The mission was nearly scrubbed, but commanders decided to proceed. The strategic importance of Schweinfurt's ball-bearing production justified the risk. Only about half the expected P-47 escort fighters were able to rendezvous with the bomber formations. As the B-17 seconds in their combat box formations approached Aachen on the German-Belgian border, the Thunderbolts waggled their wings in the traditional farewell gesture and turned for home, their fuel exhausted. The bombers continued alone into Germany. Then the Luftwaffe struck with unprecedented force. German fighter controllers had tracked the formations from takeoff. Every available fighter unit in Western Germany was scrambled. Over 300 German fighters attacked the bomber stream in coordinated waves. Single-engine Messerschmitt 109 seconds and Focke-Wulf 190 seconds came in 3 and 4 abreast, attacking head-on. The attacks were pressed home with tremendous aggression. They were followed by twin-engine fighters firing WGR-21 rockets from 1,000 yards out. The massive rockets forced formations to scatter as individual B-17 seconds took evasive action. This broke up the combat boxes and ruined the mutually supporting defensive fire. The Luftwaffe had learned from experience and refined their tactics specifically to break up the combat box. They focused attacks on individual groups, overwhelming local defensive capabilities. Damaged bombers that fell out of formation were immediately swarmed by German fighters. The German pilots flew from home bases in Germany, many within 50 miles of the bomber route. After expending ammunition, they would land, be rearmed and refueled in 15 to 20 minutes, and take off again to attack the same bomber stream a second or even third time. By the time the formations reached Schweinfurt, 28 bombers had already been lost. The 305th Bomb Group, LeMay's old unit, was hit particularly hard. Flying in the most exposed low-group position, they bore the brunt of repeated attacks. 13 aircraft from the 305th failed to return to England, the highest loss of any group on the mission. 130 men from the 305th were killed, captured, or listed as missing. The bombing was accurate despite the chaos. Post-strike reconnaissance photographs showed severe damage to several production facilities, but the cost was beyond anything previously experienced. Of the 291 B-17 seconds that departed England that morning, 60 were shot down by fighters or flak. Another 17 returned to England so heavily damaged that they had to be scrapped. Another 121 aircraft landed with varying degrees of battle damage. Total losses represented over 26% of the attacking force. Aircrew casualties were equally severe. 650 men were lost out of 2,900 who flew the mission, representing 22% of all crews. At that loss rate, an aircrew member had virtually no chance of surviving a 25-mission tour. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Staff Sergeant Harold Monroe Graham, ball turret gunner with the 305th Bomb Group, had flown 27 missions successfully. The night before Black Thursday, Graham wrote a letter home that his family preserved. "We all know what we're facing tomorrow. Schweinfurt is the toughest target in Germany, but the formation will protect us as much as anything can. If we stay together, if we hold the box, no matter what happens, some of us will make it through." The formation gives us that chance. Graham's aircraft was shot down over Schweinfurt the next day. His bomber took several direct hits, caught fire, and went into a spin. Only 3 parachutes were seen leaving the aircraft. Graham was not among the survivors. He was 22 years old. Analysis of the mission showed once again that bombers maintaining formation discipline survived at much higher rates than those that scattered or fell out. The bombers that held their positions had better than a 50% chance of reaching home. Those that fell out had almost no chance. The concentrated defensive fire had shot down some German fighters, damaged many others, and most importantly, forced German pilots to break off their attacks earlier. Without the combat box, losses would have been even higher. The formation had done its job. It just wasn't enough without fighter escort. The immediate aftermath of Black Thursday forced a fundamental reassessment of American daylight bombing doctrine. The loss rates were simply too high. Crews could not be expected to survive 25 mission tours when each mission had a 20% casualty rate. For the rest of 1943, the 8th Air Force limited its operations to targets within range of fighter escorts. Deep penetration missions to targets in central and southern Germany were suspended indefinitely, but this was not a defeat, rather a necessary operational pause while solutions were implemented. The primary solution was developing and deploying long-range fighter escorts. By late 1943, the North American P-51B Mustang was entering service with the 8th Air Force. Powered by a Packard-built Rolls-Royce Merlin engine and equipped with external drop tanks, the P-51B had a combat radius of over 650 miles, enough to escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back. The Mustang combined this extraordinary range with excellent performance. At 30,000 feet altitude, where bombers and German fighters operated, the P-51B could match or exceed the performance of Bf 109 seconds and FW 190 seconds. When P-51 equipped fighter groups began escorting bomber missions in February 1944, the strategic balance shifted decisively in favor of the Allies. The combat box formations continued in use throughout the war, but their role evolved. With effective fighter escorts available, the rigid defensive formations became less critical for pure survival. Instead, they became more important for bombing accuracy. The tight formations ensured concentrated bomb patterns on target, maximizing damage. As the Luftwaffe fighter threat diminished progressively through 1944, flak became the primary danger. The 36-plane group formation, more compact and easier to maintain than the massive 54-plane wing boxes, became standard for most missions from May 1944 onward. By February 1944, when the 8th Air Force returned to Schweinfurt during the Big Week missions, everything had changed. Long-range P-51 Mustangs escorted the bombers all the way to the target and back. The B-17G with its 13 machine guns provided comprehensive defensive coverage. The combat box formations had been refined through 2 years of combat experience, and most importantly, the Luftwaffe was beginning to collapse under sustained attrition. German fighter losses were mounting at unsustainable rates. Experienced pilots were being killed faster than they could be replaced. The strategic air campaign that had seemed on the verge of failure in October 1943 was now succeeding. By D-Day on June 6, 1944, Allied air forces had achieved complete air supremacy over Europe. German fighters had been largely swept from the skies through systematic attrition. Bomber formations could operate with relative impunity over most of Germany. Loss rates dropped from 20% in October 1943 to 3 to 5% by mid-1944, levels that were sustainable. Crews' chances of completing 25 mission tours improved dramatically. The psychological impact was enormous. New crews arriving in theatre could look at veterans who had completed tours and know that survival was possible. The effectiveness of the combat box is demonstrated by comprehensive survival statistics. Of the 12,731 B-17 seconds built during the entire war, 4,735 were lost in combat operations, representing a loss rate of 37%. But detailed analysis shows clearly that bombers maintaining formation discipline in combat boxes had survival rates significantly higher than the overall average, while those that became separated had survival rates far below average. A bomber that fell out of formation had perhaps a 20% chance of reaching friendly territory. Most were shot down within minutes. Conversely, a bomber that maintained its position had better than a 50% chance of survival, even on heavily opposed missions. The difference between life and death was often nothing more than holding position in the combat box. Technical Sergeant Albert Brown, radio operator flying with the 305th Bomb Group, wrote in a letter home that was later donated to the National Air Force Museum, "The formation is everything. You see a bomber fall out and you know he's done for. The fighters swarm him like sharks around blood in the water. But if you stay in the box, if you hold your position no matter what, the other bombers protect you with their guns and you protect them with yours. It's the only way any of us survive. We depend on each other absolutely. That's what gets you through. Knowing you're not alone, that if you do your job and stay in position, the formation will protect you as much as anything can in this war." The men who flew in those formations understood exactly what they were doing and accepted the risks knowingly. They knew the statistics. Intelligence officers briefed them on loss rates before missions. They could count empty beds in their barracks. They attended memorial services for friends. They knew that completing a 25-mission tour required not just skill and courage, but enormous luck. Yet they continued, mission after mission. They climbed into their bombers, formed up in their combat boxes, and flew into the teeth of German defences. They did this because the formation, for all its limitations, gave them the best chance of survival. And they did it because they believed in their mission. The combat box represented a uniquely American approach to warfare. Rather than relying solely on individual skill or superior technology, it emphasized teamwork, discipline, and mutual support. Each bomber was both protector and protected. Each gunner's field of fire overlapped with his neighbors, creating a web of defensive coverage that was far greater than the sum of its parts. This collective defense required extraordinary discipline. Pilots had to maintain exact positions despite turbulence, flak, and fighter attacks. Gunners had to coordinate their fire, calling out targets and avoiding shooting at friendly aircraft. Navigators had to plot courses that kept formations together. Every crew member had to execute his role perfectly, knowing that failure could doom not just his own aircraft, but those flying beside him. The psychological burden was immense. Flying in formation meant you watched other bombers get hit. You saw them explode, saw them spin down trailing fire, saw parachutes blossom as crews bailed out over hostile territory. You knew that could be you on the next mission, or the one after that. The odds were not in your favor, yet the formation also provided comfort. You were not alone. Dozens of other aircraft flew with you, sharing the same risks, facing the same dangers. When your bomber was hit, when engines failed or control surfaces were damaged, the formation stayed with you as long as possible, their guns still protecting you even as you struggled to stay airborne. The bond between crews was forged in this shared danger. They trained together, flew together, fought together, and too often died together. The formation was more than a tactical arrangement. It was a brotherhood of survival, a testament to the idea that together, ordinary men could accomplish extraordinary things. The Germans, for all their tactical innovation and individual skill, never fully countered the combat box. They developed new tactics, heavier weapons, jet fighters, and rockets. They attacked with ferocity and courage that commanded respect even from their enemies. But they could not overcome the fundamental mathematics of the formation. A single German fighter, no matter how skilled the pilot, could not survive sustained exposure to the concentrated fire of multiple bombers. The closing speeds were too high, the number of guns too great, the margin for error too small. German pilots learned to make quick, slashing attacks and break away immediately. Prolonged engagements with massed formations meant death. This forced the Luftwaffe into a war of attrition it could not win. Every mission cost them irreplaceable pilots and aircraft. The Americans, backed by enormous industrial capacity, could replace losses. The Germans could not. By mid-1944, the Luftwaffe was a shadow of its former strength, its experienced pilots dead or captured, its replacement pilots inadequately trained, its fuel supplies dwindling. The combat box had achieved what its creators intended. It had made daylight strategic bombing feasible. It had protected bomber crews well enough that missions could be sustained despite heavy losses. And when combined with long-range fighter escorts, it had helped win air supremacy over Europe, paving the way for the invasion and ultimate Allied victory. In the history of aerial warfare, few tactical innovations have had greater impact or required greater courage from the men who executed them. The combat box stands as a testament to both American ingenuity and the extraordinary bravery of young men who flew tight formation through walls of fire above Hitler's Europe. These men, average age 23, many fresh from farms and small towns across America, climbed into their bombers day after day and faced odds that would have broken professional soldiers. They did this because they believed in their mission, that they were fighting to end tyranny, to defend freedom, to protect their families and homeland. This belief sustained them through experiences that left psychological scars many carried for the rest of their lives. The roar of engines, the smell of cordite and hydraulic fluid, the bone-deep cold at altitude, the sight of comrades dying, the constant fear barely held in check, these became the fabric of their daily existence. The combat box formations represent what ordinary Americans can accomplish when called upon to do extraordinary things. They remain one of the most remarkable tactical innovations in modern military history, accomplished not through force alone, but through the combination of American industrial might, organizational genius, and the raw courage of young men who refused to accept defeat. Curtis LeMay's innovation, born in the cold English winter of 1942 and tested in the fires of combat over Germany, saved countless lives and helped win the war. The 700 guns of the combat box were not just weapons of destruction. They were instruments of protection, symbols of collective strength, proof that disciplined teamwork could overcome seemingly impossible odds. The German pilots who first mocked the flying fortress, who dismissed American bombers as easy prey, learned a hard lesson. The combat box transformed vulnerable individual aircraft into a nearly impregnable flying fortress of interlocking defensive fire. What seemed like a simple tactical formation became a war-winning weapon, and at its heart were the men, the pilots who held formation despite exhaustion and fear, the gunners who tracked targets through walls of tracer fire, the navigators who plotted courses through flak and fighters, the bombardiers who held steady on bomb runs while death filled the sky around them. They flew the combat box, they trusted their lives to formation, discipline, and mutual protection. And they brought the war to Germany's industrial heart, mission after mission, until victory was won. Their legacy endures. The combat box proved that tactical innovation, when combined with courage and discipline, can change the course of history. It demonstrated that protecting each other, fighting as one, Americans could achieve what seemed impossible, and it stands as an eternal reminder of the price of freedom, paid in the cold skies over Europe by young men who believed in something greater than themselves. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell, so you don't miss any upload from us.